Well, good morning. My name is Mike Howard. Well, good morning. My name is Mike Howard, and I want to welcome you to my very first podcast, the Art of Ronin Leadership podcast. We're coming to you on September 6th, 2021, Labor Day. I thought this would be a great day to launch this particular podcast. For those of you who don't know me, I have just written a book called The Art of Ronin Leadership, which I'm showing you right now. It's a strategy, execution, and sustained success. I'll tell you a little bit about the book. I'll tell you a little bit about why we call this podcast The Art of Ronin Leadership podcast. This podcast has been a brainchild of mine for a long time. I've always wanted to write a book, and unfortunately with quarantine last year during COVID, I took that unfortunate circumstance and was able to do something productive during that time. And so I wrote a book. And I wrote a book based on my experiences in 3 different organizations. And I'll get into that a little bit later, so you know a little bit more about me. But the idea is that this podcast is going to be about leadership. Sometimes it'll be just me talking about various aspects of leadership, talking about leaders that I have admired over the years and still do. We'll also talk about next generation leadership, and I'll talk about that in a little bit too. The people that are coming up behind us who are going to take over in leadership positions. We'll also have some fun too with this podcast. It won't always be serious and about leadership. We'll have different guests on, maybe talking about different things that are going on in Las Vegas. One of the beauties of living here in Las Vegas, we have the best entertainment, we have the best restaurants, we have the best shows, best experiences. I have been blessed, my wife Janice and I have been very blessed in getting to meet a lot of really interesting people here in the Las Vegas Valley. We also have a worldwide connection of friends and colleagues in different professions, and we intend to bring those people on too as we progress in our podcast. But this is really exciting. This is something I've really wanted to do for a long time, and I'm quite ready. I'm right now armed with my bulletproof coffee that I start with every morning, so I'm fortified and ready to start the podcast. I think we should start with who's Mike Howard. There are a fair amount of you listening to this podcast who know me, your friends, your colleagues, family members. But obviously we want to reach out to a wide audience, and there are a lot of people that don't know who Mike Howard is. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing myself to you, and that'll give you some context as to the book, the sort of the impetus for this podcast. I was born in 1956, Waltham, Massachusetts. I'm half black, half Japanese. My father was career military, and he spent 20 years in the military. I met my mother in Japan, actually at a flower garden. He didn't speak a lick of Japanese, but somehow he was able to communicate to my mother, and they eventually got married, and they had me. And I don't call Massachusetts my home though. Massachusetts Waltham was where I was born, in an army hospital. But my father traveled around a bit, as you can imagine, in being in the military. So went to Washington State for a little bit, but eventually ended up in California, and California is where I call home. We ended up in a place called the Monterey Peninsula. For those of you who have been there, you know it's a beautiful place. I probably didn't appreciate it as much when I was growing up, but later on in life, I realized what a wonderful place it was to grow up in. There was a huge army base there called Fort Ord. It was one of the 2 major training bases for the U.S. Army. My dad was assigned there, and we lived on a block where it was mostly GIs, Army guys and their spouses and families. It was a wonderful existence. Loved growing up near the Army base. Really became to understand at a young age the idea of patriotism, sacrifice and these folks that were defending our country. My dad did a tour of duty in Vietnam, 67, 68. He won the Bronze Star. He also did an unaccompanied tour to Germany. My mom and I visited him there. But for the most part, he had a very unusual career in that, and it seems like most of the GIs on that block, they were all sergeants for the most part, non-commissioned officers. They weren't rotated a lot. So we had a very stable neighborhood, a lot of nuclear families. It was also a very diverse neighborhood. And across the street, we had a Mexican family, and we had a Vietnamese American family, a Korean American family, and of course, half black, half Japanese. So it was a very mixed and diverse neighborhood. And that's what I grew up with. And that's, I guess, one of the beauties of living in California, is you actually have that kind of experience where you may not have that in other parts of the country. One of the things about Mike Howard is that I've always wanted to be a police officer. Ever since I was a little kid, I could think of nothing else. I used to watch cop shows, and I used to watch, all kinds of army shows and cowboy shows. So that was kind of my thing, and I really enjoyed it. And I never strayed from that. I remember years later, after my mother passed away around 2008, I went back to the neighborhood I grew up in, and I talked to a neighbor across the street who had known me since I was a little boy. And she remembered, she said, all you ever talked about was being a police officer. And so I had that in my mind throughout my entire life, and I never strayed from that. And even as I progressed through junior high school and then high school, I eventually went to San Jose State University, where I majored in criminal justice, obviously, with a minor in sociology. And I really enjoyed my time there. I had some wonderful professors, and eventually ended up joining the Oakland Police Department in Oakland, California. Those of you who may not be familiar with Oakland is a wonderful city, but Oakland also has a tendency to be a very violent, crime-ridden city. And it certainly was there during the late 70s when I was a police officer. And it was my first grounding in any type of work. I thoroughly enjoyed being a police officer. And in my book, I talk a bit about that time and sort of the buds of leadership. Not that I was a leader, but I certainly saw some interesting leadership in other people that I document in the book. I probably would have stayed as a police officer for 20 years and called it a day, but I've always been an avid reader, and one of the things that you'll learn in this podcast is that if you're going to be a leader, real leaders always read. You're constantly reading and getting better in that craft of leadership. So I've always been an avid reader, and I'm a history buff. I love history. So one day when I was off duty, I went to a bookstore and I bought this book called Piercing the Right. I still have a copy of it here at the house. And it detailed the exploits of what they call the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS. And the OSS was the precursor to today's Central Intelligence Agency. At the start of World War II, America didn't have a spy organization. And it's one of the reasons why we got hit in Pearl Harbor and we lacked the proper intelligence. There was no centralized mechanism or apparatus to collect, analyze, and then kind of use intelligence to defend ourselves. Well, they created under Roosevelt the OSS, and these folks were trained in the usual combat arts, how to kill people, how to infiltrate enemy lines, sabotage, all that kind of stuff. But they were also trained in espionage to learn how to recruit assets, especially in Nazi-occupied Europe, to give us information on what the enemy was doing, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very compelling and storied group of warriors. But as I was reading this book, something came to my mind. I thought, wow, it might be really interesting kind of looking at this intelligence thing. And so one day, kind of on a lark, I went across the Bay Bridge to San Francisco. Oakland's located right across from San Francisco. I went to the Federal Building. And at that time, believe it or not, the CIA actually had an open presence. For a spy organization, they had a presence at the federal buildings. So I went in there and inquired, told them I was a current police officer in Oakland. This is during the Reagan administration. Reagan had just taken over, and Reagan was starting to build up military, police, law enforcement at all levels, but primarily federal. And the people that talked to me said they could use someone with my background. And it took about a year of effort. There was a lot of testing, examinations, polygraphs, going back to Washington, D.C. for psychological evaluations, all that kind of stuff. But after about a year, I was able to join the Central Intelligence Agency, and I spent 22 years there, and it was a wonderful career. And as we go into this podcast, I can delve more into different aspects of my career at CIA. But needless to say, I really enjoyed it. I had great experiences, traveled the world, primarily Africa and Asia, but did a little bit of Middle East and Latin America. Spent a lot of time in what they call counterterrorism, working with our allies around the world to go after bad guys, terrorists, and really enjoyed it. I probably would have stayed there, but there were things that happened at CIA that became kind of political. And as it turned out, an opportunity presented itself to me in the great state of Washington to work for a pretty well-known company called Microsoft. And I eventually made the jump from the public sector to the private sector and went to Microsoft. Originally, I was hired as the director of what they call executive protection. So my job and the team that I was leading, our job was to protect Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, who was the number 2 at Microsoft, and various high-level executives there. I'd had a bit of background doing that kind of work when I was at CIA. I ran I didn't run. I was actually on the detail for our director of CIA, William J. Casey, during the Reagan years, and Casey was a cabinet level official under Reagan. And I had the privilege of serving on Casey's protective detail. But as things happen, those of you who are in private industry know things tend to change very quickly. And while I thoroughly enjoyed that work, after about a year, my then boss, Charlie McNerney, called me in one day and said, "Hey, things have changed. There's been a reorg, and you are now in charge of all of physical security for the company." So then I became Director of Security for Microsoft, which eventually morphed into what they call the Chief Security Officer. So really responsible for all the physical security in the company. And that includes everything from the guard forces that guard our various campuses around the world to any employee who gets kidnapped. We have to manage that issue. Terrorism threats of violence, investigations. We have of course, the executive protection team. We have an intelligence analysis organization to look at any threats against Microsoft people or its assets. We had a technology team. We had a risk management team. So it was a really diverse and very interesting and high stress job. But I really enjoyed it. Learned a lot. But after I think I worked there now, after about 16 years at Microsoft, I figured I'd had enough. I wanted to call it a day. There were other things I wanted to do in life. One of them was writing, and I eventually wrote this book I talked about. And a lot of what I do now is I'm still writing. I mean, I think that is probably my primary avocation. I love to write. I'm working on a fiction novel now, but I think I've got another leadership book in me, and I'll talk about that at another time. But I'm also involved in, my wife and I have started our own foundation, the Mike and Janice Howard Foundation, primarily directed towards looking at-risk youth. And we're trying to do a lot to help at-risk youth because it's really near and dear to our heart. We want to help the next generation with as much as we can in terms of the tools, knowledge, education they need to succeed. We're involved. I'm a member of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Foundation Board of Directors, and that has been very gratifying to work with people who are supporting the Metropolitan Police Department here in Las Vegas. we're really big on philanthropy. And as an aside, those of you who don't know my personal background, my wife Janice and I, we've been married 4 years. We just celebrated our 4th year anniversary last month. But we actually met in college many years ago. The hair here was a lot darker, and she still looks the same to me. I always tell her that. But yeah, we met in college years ago, and I like to say, well, we kind of had went our separate ways, and for 40 years or so, we had no contact with each other. Both of us married really wonderful people, and unfortunately, both of our spouses passed away. And tragic as those circumstances were, God led us to get back together again after all those years, and we're enjoying a very beautiful marriage. And that also is that takes primacy over everything, over the writing, over the podcasting, over everything. Because without a solid foundation of family and friends, and if you're married, your spouse, everything kind of pales in comparison. So that's a little bit about Mike Howard, where I am right now, and my background. And as we go along on this podcast, you'll get to learn more about me and some of the details of what I've just kind of covered at a 50,000 foot view. So now, I guess it begs the question, why this podcast? There are a lot of leadership podcasts out there. I know I listen to a lot of them. And a lot of wonderful people out there doing great content. And I think I have something to lend to that conversation. I have a varied background. And one of the things and I encourage you to read this book. You'll find it on MikeHowardAuthor.com and on Amazon. But one of the things that I try to get across on the book is leadership is a journey, number one, never ends. I'm 65 years old, and I just received Medicare, which I never thought I'd be happy about, but I am elated. But that aside, even at the age of 65, I'm still learning. I'm still honing my craft of leadership. I've done a lot of speaking on leadership at a lot of conferences, a lot of panels over the years, etc. But I'm still learning, still reading, I'm still growing. So that's number one, it's a journey. Number two, leadership is not about getting everything right all the time. Yes, you're expected to make the hard decisions, and that's part of what you take on if you decide that you want to be a leader. But you don't always have the right answers. You need to surround yourself with a good team, a great team, people who will back you up, people who will give you the right opinions on how to make a good decision, especially in times of crisis. So you're not in it alone. You're not expected to be in it alone, and you're not expected to have all the answers. Another aspect of leadership that I tend to cover is the understanding that you are going to make mistakes. You're not going to be perfect. There's a fair amount of leadership books out there that don't really go into that aspect. I go into that aspect a lot in my book. I talk about the mistakes I have made and hopefully learn from those mistakes. The things that can get you in trouble or off track as a leader. And so I talk about that because I want people to understand that leaders are human beings. And while we have the mantle, while we have the responsibility to run programs, to manage people, to lead people, we're also humans. And humans have frailties. We feel fear, we feel anxiety, we feel insecure. And I go into a lot about that in my book. I felt a lot of insecurity in my as I was growing my leadership career. But that's okay. The idea is not that you're not insecure. The idea is that you're able to do something about it and turn that around to make it a strength, to recognize it and move on. That's where emotional intelligence comes in. And I think one of the seminal parts of the book is the idea of being selfless. And I heard that term for the first time in the context of leadership from a really dear friend and a mentor to many of us at CIA named Bill Cervenak. And Bill unfortunately passed away a year or so ago. after a great career at CIA and then a post-CIA career helping a youth league, baseball youth league in Virginia. And there's actually a baseball park named after him. But one of the things he did talk to me about one time was about being selfless. At the time, I was getting ready to start leading teams in his organization. And this man had been a World War II, no, he's not that old. This man had been a colonel in the Marine Corps and fought in Vietnam. Again, a great leader at CIA that a lot of us looked up to. And one of the things he said to me, and it just stuck with me over all these years, is that once you start to become a leader, you've got to flip your mindset. So up until that time, it's about you, growing your career, making sure you're getting best performance reviews, getting the best opportunities for promotion. You're looking out for yourself, and that's okay. It's okay, and that goes throughout the rest of your life. You'll always want to do that in your career, to make sure that you're maximizing your ability to go up the rung, so to speak, and get those promotions and get those things that you deserve because you've been working hard and busting your butt. But Bill's point was, when you become a leader, your perspective has to change. So while you're always worried about your career, or not worried about it, while you're always wanting to enhance your career, as a leader, your first responsibility is the care and feeding of the people that you are tasked to lead. That means you're worried about their career progression. You're worried about what they need so they can grow their careers. You're worried about their problems. Sometimes they're going to bring their personal problems to you. And that kind of bleeds over into the workplace. That's just normal, right? So that was what Bill was trying to get across. And that's one of the main themes of my book, is that you've got to flip that thing to be selfless. You're thinking about your troops first, you come second. And it's been my experience that that's not always the case, and sometimes it's not really the case in most circumstances, where people in leadership positions, they don't make that switch, and it's still all about them. And that's why you hear from the HR professionals all the time that when people leave companies, many times they don't leave companies because they didn't like their work. They left the companies because they couldn't stand their managers, because the managers really took no interest in them, no effort into their lives. And so that's one of the aspects that I talk about, learning about being selfless. And there are a lot of things that we can kind of discuss and dissect in the book. And again, this is not the time to do that. This is more of an introduction into our podcast. One of the things I want to emphasize is that I really want this podcast to be interactive. Interactive in the sense that I want to hear from you. And when we do a podcast like this one, and we're going to put it out there, we'd like to hear from you. Did you like it? Did you not like it? What are the things that you want to hear about? Whether it's leadership or the CIA or working in a company like Microsoft. Again, while this is the Art of Ronin Leadership podcast, and leadership certainly will be a main focus, I don't want it to be the only focus. And if there's enough of you out there that want to know what it's like to work in a company like Microsoft, in a tech company, or what it's like to be a CIA officer, or what it's like to be a police officer when I was a young police officer in Oakland, California, or what it takes to make a good marriage work. I mean, it runs the gamut, right? And I think that's one of the things I really am excited about when thinking about this podcast and launching this podcast, is to just delve into any number of issues. We will have guests live here at our house in Las Vegas, but also we can do anything virtually, as you all well know, and we're going to do that with various guest speakers. And then if there's people that you want to hear, that's fine too. I'll certainly along the way give you an idea of some of the podcasts that I listen to, some of the books that I've read, things that I do to try to keep sharp in the leadership field. I guess I want to end this particular podcast on this Labor Day with a few thoughts about what's going on in our world and the world situation. I've always had a global mindset. I've been lucky enough, I've been blessed enough, whether working at CIA or working at Microsoft, to have traveled to a lot of places in this world. And I know that right now the world is in a very precarious place. COVID is still here, and in a lot of countries it's still raging. Here in the United States, we have the Delta variant, and so we're dealing with that. I think vaccination rates are going up, but we still need to get more people vaccinated, and we still have COVID to deal with. And that is certainly, I mean, who would have thought 2 years ago that a virus would have affected our lives so much as it has? But that's the reality. We also have, I think, a crisis of faith in government, or lack of faith in government and in our business leaders. I think it's very hard for a lot of people to find good role models that you can say, hey, emulate, or tell your children to emulate. I think there's been a lack of transparency at all levels of government and the private sector. And people just want to know the truth, want to be told the truth. And so I think there's a certain amount of anxiety, not just in America, but around the world. But right now we're talking about the US. People are uneasy about the economy. People are uneasy about politics. I've never seen our country so divided politically. I mean, if you think about it, this whole thing with masks or no masks has become such a political thing when it actually should just be based on medical data, science, and let the science drive policy. But that's not the case. And so we have all this angst going on in the world. And that, to me, is also an opportunity for leaders to step up and become great leaders by being transparent. Whatever things are going right, whatever things are going wrong, just be honest and transparent to us, the American people. If you're a business leader, be transparent and open and honest with your team, your company. Certainly there are things that you have to work on, and you can't just regurgitate everything until you kind of figure out the solution to a problem. But people, I think, are mature enough to accept bad news, and not sugar-coated bad news, but bad news, as long as there's an attendant solution to it. So leaders at all levels, whether it's government or private sector, need to learn to be transparent. Leaders also need to communicate often. One of the things that I remember reading about years ago, I read a book by a guy named Jack Welch. Those of you who are younger may not have heard of Jack Welch, but in my generation, Jack Welch was a legend in the business world. He was the chairman of of GE, and he really mastered the art of how to take an unwieldy, big bureaucratic organization and make it lean, mean, and make it work. And he turned GE around. He wrote several books about his exploits and what he learned. And one of the things he talked about a lot was communication. Like when he first took over GE and he had his strategic plan, he made sure that every time he spoke to his team, whether it was large groups or whether it was his own leadership team, he hammered the strategy over and over again, to the point where he said he knew people were probably getting sick of hearing about it, but they wouldn't forget it. In this time of angst, crisis, leaders need to be not just transparent, open, and honest, but they need to communicate, and communicate often. Tell the people what's going on. Tell them what's the state of play. Give them hope for the future. Things are going to get better, because inevitably they do. No matter what hard circumstances we as a country or our businesses have faced, good times are always coming. You have to get through the hurdle first, but you need to communicate often to your teams. And too many leaders kind of shelter in place, hide in isolation, don't say anything, figure they won't rock the boat that way. Well, that's not the way to handle a time like now. You need leaders to be honest and to speak plainly to the people. I think the last aspect is that during this time, leaders need to instill hope. I said earlier today, like, we're human beings, right? We're not automatons, we're not robots. We feel fear, we feel insecurity, we feel the same angst as the people that we're leading. But taking on that mantle of leadership means that there's an added responsibility for you to be that clear voice in the storm to help keep your teams together and to give them hope that the future is going to be better. This is not pie in the sky, Pollyanna, kind of thing. You have to be real, as I said to them, about whatever the problems you're facing. But you have to give them a sense of hope that we'll get through this as a team, that we have the tools, we have the capabilities, we have the mindset to win, to move forward, to drive through these problems and get out on the other end better and stronger. Because with every crisis that you go through, whether it's a personal crisis, like my wife and I went through the loss of our spouses, or whether it's a business crisis, while you don't want to go through it at the time, it makes you stronger. In my wife Janice's case and my case, it's made our marriage stronger because we've suffered loss, we've felt loss, and we take extra effort to say I love you and to just make sure we're present and understand that this life we have is fleeting, and you better make the most of it every single day, whether it's personal relationships in your marriage or whether it's your business acumen and conduct. So those are just kind of general things that have been on my mind as I've been, like the rest of you, watching the news and seeing things going on. Leadership is the key. Leadership is the answer to many of the problems that we're suffering in the United States and also in the world. The problem is that we have a lack of real leadership. That art of leadership has been lost. It's been lost to going back to that selflessness versus selfish. There are too many selfish leaders worrying about themselves more than their people, right? So that's a big part of the problem. And leaders have forgotten their way. And I think on this podcast, whether it's me talking to you, or whether it's the various people I'm going to bring on board to speak to leadership and to life, we want this to be a hopeful podcast. We want people to come away with this not just armed with great information on how to become a better leader, or a better person, a better citizen, not just in the United States, but of this thing we call the world. But we also want you to come out of here feeling hopeful for the future, whether you're married or not, whether you have children or not, hopeful for all of us who inhabit this planet. I intend to do this podcast once a week, and like I said, really, as we post these podcasts, really want a lot of feedback from you so that we can hone and craft the podcast to make it as meaningful for you as hopefully as it is for me, because I'm enjoying the heck out of doing this. So I'm going to sign off for now. I hope you all are enjoying a wonderful Labor Day holiday. And again, the book is The Art of Ronin Leadership, and you can find it on MikeHowardAuthor.com and also on Amazon. And I think you will really enjoy the book. But more importantly, I just want you to be a part of this podcast, to be a part of our community here, so that not only hopefully will we be able to impart things to you that you can use in your professional and your personal lives, but I want to learn from you as well. And because like I said earlier in the podcast, leadership is a journey. You're always learning and always growing. So let's learn and grow together. So until next time, stay safe, be well, stay hopeful. Bye.